All right. The final presentation of the day, and it's a doozy. We're going to hit on equal access, equity, and non-discrimination. What an exciting topic to end the day with. So what we want to do is just go over some of the regulations that are applicable to HOPWA, particularly around discrimination and non-discrimination laws. We're going to talk about how these how to meet these regulations and guidance, particularly as part of your program design and setup, and then end the day with making sure that you're low barrier. I think all programs want to be low barrier, and I think all programs think they are low barrier, but there's always more that you can do to actually be low barrier, or at least there are things you can always consider, right? Because there's always limitations. Say, we would love to do X, but we don't want staff to be at the office till 9 p.m. doing intakes and applications. So just some additional ideas to think through about really, if we tie it to the very first slide of the day, if you don't have to worry about 2 pieces of eligibility, how do you make sure your program reflects all of that? So straight from HOPWA regulations. So HOPWA regulations, if you once again, if you are regs nerds like Heather and I, HOPWA regulations are the like absolute musts of the program, right? The things that are just non-negotiable. They're at 24 CFR 574. HOPWA doesn't have a lot. So it's actually an interesting read because it can probably take you a few minutes. You think about the millions of dollars that come out really come down to not a lot of regulations. So what HOPWA does say about non-discrimination and equal opportunity are listed up there. So within the population eligible for this program, the non-discrimination equal opportunity requirements set forth are the following, right? So the 2 key ones are fair housing. Makes sense. It's a HUD program, so you need to follow fair housing and all that goes along with it. And we're going to break down a few of those ideas. I think generally everyone understands fair housing if you're in that housing game. What's bigger, particularly when we talk about eligible populations, is affirmative outreach. So we mentioned this one in the last slide, particularly when it comes to marketing. But HOPWA regulations say a grantee or project sponsor must adopt procedures to ensure that all persons who qualify for the assistance, regardless of their race, color, religion, sex, age, national origin, familial status, or handicap, know of the availability of the HOPWA program. So in there is a federal requirement to somehow outreach and market your services to anyone, regardless of whatever barriers could be in the way, particularly if it's one of the protected classes that you see up there. So we'll have a few slides later on that really break this idea down a little further and how to operationalize it. But this is something that usually when we talk about, most programs are really surprised about, right? Or in some of our more daring attendees will push back and say, there's no way we could market our program, right? Because we already have wait lists, we already have all these needs, and we'll say, we get that, right? But it is a requirement you do something, because otherwise we bring this up, because if everyone who works in an agency looks the same way, acts the same way, talks the same way, chances are you all have the exact same networks. So you're only telling the same people about HOPWA. And so it's just this tunnel vision of only serving the same people who look like you, talk like you, think like you, come from the same place. And that's where this becomes problematic. So really thinking through affirmative outreach and how to apply that will be key. So a different regulation, CFR Part 5, equal access. So this applies to all HUD programs. So equal access to HUD-assisted or HUD-insured housing. A determination of eligibility for housing that is assisted by HUD or subject to a mortgage insured by HUD shall be made in accordance with the eligibility requirements provided by such a program by HUD, HOPWA, and HOPWA requirements, and such housing shall be made available without regard to actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. And so I'm going to assume for a lot of activities that you guys do, this probably isn't a problem, right? But we bring this up because for some programs that do facility-based housing, particularly some programs that do like short-term, like emergency shelter, they start to get in trouble because they start weeding people out based upon their actual perceived sexual orientation. Or everyone's favorite political topic of the day, gender identity or gender expression, right? So we'll talk about that in the next slide, right? But all of these are covered by federal regulations, including for HOPWA. So this is also why it's great when you think about the definition of family. If you think about non-discrimination, it doesn't matter if you are married, have the legal right to marry, want to get married, right? So that's for 30 years, that was HOPWA's definition. So while other programs would tie eligibility to legal status, and whoever decided, HOPWA 30 years ago said, we don't even care about the right to be able to be married. They do politically, right? But for eligibility, we don't care. Who's important to you is important to you, and that's all that matters. So little backdoor ways the federal government has been more progressive than they could let on to. So this applies to all HUD programs, including HOPWA. To really hit home this idea about equal access, particular gender identity, because I said this is something that's, you don't even have to like the news. I'm a news junkie. That's all I do in my free time is read and watch different news things. But this is clearly a big issue. So we bring this up especially because this has always been part of regulations. And a few years ago, the federal government proposed to strike it down or to limit its usefulness in all HUD programs. A change in federal administration, they struck that. So this is still in existence for all HUD programs, HOPWA, non-HOPWA, ESG, any HUD-funded emergency shelter, this applies. So this idea of gender identity and gender expression means people cannot be discriminated against, right? So for some programs, that means if someone wants to go in an emergency shelter, you're going to place them into the space for how they identify. You cannot just screen someone out and say, we don't think you are that gender, you weren't born that gender, and however you couch that, for your safety, for your consideration, we're going to put you somewhere else that is federally protected. So it just things to think through, right? Because we cite this, but when we particularly start talking about forms and applications, right, not asking the right questions the right way isn't violating this, but to get to that idea of how do you really create an inclusive program that isn't discriminating against people, not just by the letter of the law, but that spirit of really being open and inclusive to however someone is or identifies, because that's what builds that relationship, that builds that trust. Another big one is the American with Disabilities Act. We touched on this previously also, but to delve more into it, so the ADA prohibits discrimination based on disability in all programs, services, and activities. Programs including HOPWA must provide services for persons with disabilities, including reasonable accommodations. And that's really what we're going to focus a lot of our time on, is reasonable accommodations. So reasonable accommodations when needed to use their services. So what a reasonable accommodation is a change, exception, or adjustment to a rule, policy, or practice. So next slide, we'll have a few examples, but it's just changing some of your things to make so that a person with disabilities can have an equal opportunity to enjoy the use of your services, right? Or somewhere else, the dwelling or property, whatever that is. And so programs are always good about thinking about reasonable accommodations for others, right? They'll say like that shelter doesn't have a wheelchair accessible ramp, right? That building doesn't, we need to fix that. What programs aren't good about thinking about, particularly in HOPWA, is how they are probably not offering reasonable accommodations. And if push comes to shove and a lawyer went to legal aid, you would probably be held to violating the ADA. So let's talk about reasonable accommodations for HOPWA. So really, when you're thinking about this, a reasonable accommodation is any change in the way things are customarily done that enables a person with disabilities to enjoy the opportunities, right, your requirements. So since rules, policies, practices, and services may have a different effect on persons with disabilities than non-disabled persons, treating persons with disabilities the same as everyone else actually sometimes denies them services. Right? So just because you think that you want to treat everyone equal doesn't necessarily mean you are. So the intent of what you do isn't always good. right? And so that's where programs get in trouble with the ADA. They'll say, our goal is to treat everyone equally. And then if a client pushes back, they say you realize by doing that, you actually aren't treating everyone equally because not everyone has the same capabilities, strengths, and if their barrier is something that's covered under the ADA, it's a problem. What is key, particularly when we talk about reasonable accommodations, is clients do need to request it, right? So that's a key part of this. And so all persons with disabilities do have a right to actually request that and provided a reasonable accommodation at any time, right? So if they do request it and what they're asking for is reasonable, it's something that you must grant. So examples of reasonable accommodations, particularly in the HOPWA program, allowing for assistance with or extra time to fill out or submit any paperwork. So what we see a lot on the HOPWA AAQ and some of the TA is we have to do an annual recertification. That is due December 1st. If you do not submit it by December 1st, we're going to start termination. And a client says, but I have a disability, I need extra time. They'll say, nope, absolutely not. They're starting to violate me because they've made this reasonable accommodation. We mentioned earlier this idea about a live-in aid, right? So this is what we're going to talk about. The live-in aid is a very specific terminology in the HUD world, right? So don't confuse live-in aid with what other programs might define live-in aid as, or what some of your clients define live-in aid as. So a live-in aid is someone basically who is solely moving in, whose only intent is to take care of that person. There's some additional federal requirements that explain that, but what that means is traditionally a family member would not be a live-in aid. Someone's husband or wife that's been living with them isn't a live-in aid, right? Because we talked about having to prorate assistance, there's not survivor's benefits. A live-in aid is someone maybe comes in from an agency. Maybe it is like a blood familiar relationship that isn't otherwise living with them, but they move in to take care of them. But that's the only reason they're moving in, right? So what sometimes happens though with live-in aid is I know, at least know in Maine, the state of Maine would pay for people within a family to take care of someone to try to divert them away from more expensive services like nursing homes. And so we'd see all these all the time that someone would say, my husband, my wife is a live-in aid. They even get paid to do it. And so that's the way to tease through and say that's not a HUD live-in aid, right? That is a Medicaid live-in aid. But particularly as it applies to this idea of reasonable accommodation is in theory, your client, your household, whoever needs this, needs to request it from you. I say it that way too, because we sometimes see programs that say, my client can't live on their own. I'm going to force them to get a live-in aid. You can't force them to do anything. That's not a regulatory requirement. Do they probably need one? Probably, right? Most people don't get to that point unless programs get to that point unless they see a lot of issues, but they need to request that. What's also key for reasonable accommodation that applies to live-in aids is there's a process. Right, and so what we'll do on the back end is send guidance to Henry who can forward about a process to review that, because you want to make sure that reasonable accommodation for a live-in aid is tied to something specific to a disability. You want to make sure that person isn't otherwise a family member before you approve it. But I said, we'll also see programs that say we refuse to approve this. The problem is covered by the ADA, right? So they'll say for an untold number of reasons that we won't approve this. And you just can't flat out say no. You'd go through the process and maybe they don't, right? Maybe they say, I need a live-in aid and they can't tie it to a disability. Or they say, my child needs a live-in aid. Well, if you're their parent, you're going to take care of your kid here. So we're going to deny it because you're an existing family member. What we'll also talk a little bit about tomorrow for TBRA is reasonable accommodations can be things that you probably never even thought about, such as changes to your rent standard amounts, a higher utility allowance, and larger unit sizes. So tomorrow we're going to talk about HOPWA rent standards, that maximum rent. So that almost always applies, right? Clients can't go above it within, that HOPWA guidance that goes along with it. But someone can request a reasonable accommodation, and if approved, you no longer follow your HOPWA rent standard. Right, so this is sometimes we'll see situations where clients will say, I'm in a wheelchair, my program's telling me I have to move because it's over what they can pay, but there's no other units available. I requested a reasonable accommodation, they said no. And all of a sudden, HUD's getting involved to say, well, what do you mean they said no? Right, so that reasonable accommodation, even for something as key as that, can totally affect unit eligibility. When people, yes?
Can they get reasonable accommodations simply for asking for it, or do they have to read?
So reasonable accommodations are always tied to a specific disability or issue. So the reasonable accommodation, for example, would be they have mobility issues or in a wheelchair and can't go up and down stairs. So they need a unit that has 0 stairs or an elevator, right? So they'd have a doctor's note or some sort of verification backing that up. And so you'd say, all right, that makes sense. And so maybe standard, all of the 1-bedrooms in our area within the rent standard don't meet that. But we found one that's $300 more expensive that meets that reasonable accommodation.
So this is essentially a direct connection or a nexus between the request for the reasonable accommodation, the disability, and the disability, right? So they need a 0 entry level unit, handicapped accessible unit, because they're in a wheelchair and because there are no units within your rent standard. So there's a direct connection.
But if there was a rent in my budget,
That was 0 entry,
yeah.
handicapped accessible, right, yeah.
Is there a requirement if you do find one that finds $300 more expensive? Is there a requirement that you have comparable rentals in the area that meet the same requirements, like to have the same accommodation?
Like rent reasonableness?
Yeah, we're gonna talk about rent reasonableness tomorrow. You'd probably be able to do rent reasonableness.
Right, because you're
You
comparing,
compare like units.
right. So you'd be comparing say a situation, a unit with an elevator with other units with elevators.
Right, the buildings with elevators.
So it does need to meet rent reasonableness, but it's not meeting your traditional rent standard. And so those are 2 different ideas that are tied together, but not exclusively the same. But this is where I said it's, and most of the time when I give examples, it's to the extreme. A client can say, I need a unit with an elevator because I have, gingivitis. Because you'd say, show me the direct connection, right? Because you never want to follow. No, you want to go through your process. Say, show me that correlation, that direct nexus between what you said is your issue and why you need this. And if they can't prove that, that's when you would deny it. Say, you haven't shown this. So, but in most of the most obvious situations, you're right. You just need that doctor's note if it isn't totally obvious. But so there's also the things like people needing a larger unit size. So if people have a lot of medical equipment and they need a larger unit, like a 2nd bedroom, because otherwise all their medical equipment takes up their bedroom and living room, they can request a larger unit size.
What if they have an emotional support dog and they say that emotional support dog needs its own bedroom? Do I have to give it its own bedroom? I mean, this is a real scenario now.
Yeah.
If it's your emotional support dog, it should be sleeping with you.
Support animals aren't recognized by the ADA though.
That's what I said.
They're not.
Yeah.
So they have to provide a service in order to be considered.
Like a support service animal, not an emotional support animal.
A medical service, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot of things before, but I've
Yeah,
never
that's
heard
real
that
long.
one.
Yeah. Because I no matter what, I would ask for why does that emotional support animal need its own space?
No, I asked.
Is it Clifford the big red dog? Then maybe, right? It can't sleep in the same bed with you. That would make sense why you need additional bedroom. Otherwise,
Not, but I feel like if it's emotional support, I asked him to give me documentation saying it needed its own area. Of course, he could do it, but, and I'm just like, it should sleep with you, or at the bottom of your bed, or at the foot of your bed, or.
How are you gonna have emotional support when you have
Yeah.
But one reason this stuff like this is really tying into that medical need is that documentation, right? Because
Right.
if we assume that all of our medical professionals are doing their due diligence and professional, they're going to legitimately walk through scenarios and then push back on ones that don't make sense. So to say, I need something verifying that, hopefully no one would come back to that situation and say, here's a doctor's note.
Oh, I don't know, he might be able to pull one out. He's pretty good.
And you know, and
The document isn't the.
no, it's that
isn't
nexus,
the-
right?
The thing that solidifies.
Right.
the- Approving the request. for
Right.
Additional backup document.
And it's also worth noting too, it's in any of these situations, it's someone who should be able to, the whole process involves someone who should be able to speak to it, right? So a dentist signing off on an emotional support dog needing space, you could say, this doesn't make sense. What does your dentist know about this? Right, so that's where you said you push, you don't just deny the flat out thing and say this is ridiculous, you sort of nitpick it to say, we're open to this, but we really need to cross our T's and dot our I's. The dentist saying you need this doesn't
Yeah.
make sense.
That's pretty much how I did it. But probably not
Yeah.
so many.
But there's even times you can do a reasonable accommodation for a higher utility allowance, right? So say people have a lot of medical equipment and that is skyrocketing their electric bills,
That makes sense.
then you could also do a reasonable accommodation and provide more in a utility allowance when you do a
But
rent.
not because their dog needs air conditioning.
Right.
I hope not.
I've had two people evicted because of their dogs.
See,
the
the
last few
utilities,
days.
the
Or last few
utilities
months.
and usage are directly connected to the disability.
Right.
Right.
So it's really those things to think through about, right? Once again, going through that process, right? Because in some of these scenarios, right, it's slam dunk. You're gonna be like, absolutely not. That's never gonna happen. But at least going through the process, you're not violating the ADA. You're giving clients their due process, because 99% of the time, it's gonna fall apart unless it's legitimate. And then you say, great, need this note, need to say this, we're good, moving on. So think through all of that. So because some of that's easy, but so particularly that first one, so we still see programs that violate this, right? Because they get caught up in this and just like, I'm going to get in trouble without thinking maybe there's a reason that this person can't fill this out and needs additional time. And once they request a reasonable accommodation, you bought yourself some time where you're not worried about that 12-month recertification.
Is that, we don't have to have people for reasonable accommodation, right? Like, they need to fill this out to ask for it, it's just, they just ask for it.
You could ask for it. If you also too, if you're working with somebody and you know they're extremely anxious, and every year when you do people paperwork, it's a struggle. You can offer to do it remotely. You don't have this need to request to get a doctor. No, you don't. The disability is obvious.
And see, I've been doing that and just doing the
You can
paperwork.
offer that and just write it in the file if your process is normally that people come in. And if you're treating this person differently than normal, then just document that in the file why you're doing it for Heather and not for Steve.
But I think the key in that is there's no like required form, but you want
No.
something in the file,
Say,
right? Because you, Cassie, might know, but when you hit the lottery and leave your agency and someone steps in and monitors, say, why did you do that? And there's not even a note to file. That's where it gets into trouble, right? Because it existed in your head and didn't exist anywhere else. You want something. Next slide.
She's like, yeah.
So what does all this mean, right? Just straightforward, HOPWA assistance must be made available to all eligible individual families, regardless of anything you could think of, right? So that's sort of like the list of everything we went over. But basically, just offer assistance to anyone that's eligible. Because then you're not even worried about some of the things like national origin. Right? It's not a regulatory requirement to check for those things. So if someone really got upset and pushed back and you had to say, why are you doing this? You can't say it's a regulatory requirement. Right? Other programs can. So if someone applied for HCV assistance, they'd say, this is in our regs, we have to do it. You couldn't.
I just wonder why I have to answer the same questions 97 times in my paperwork, and it doesn't matter anymore. Doesn't matter if what color they are or what, nationality or.
Well, because some of that, it doesn't affect eligibility, but you need to report on it.
Yeah.
Right? So some of those questions are tied to the HOPWA report that you send up to Henry, because HOPWA has to tell HUD and HUD has to tell Congress how many people of certain races and ethnicities they got served.
That's
So you have to ask it. They don't have to answer it.
Oh, I know, or they answer it and they put all of them.
Yeah.
I have a few of them.
Not a regulatory requirement.
all of
Yeah. It's not a requirement. So they say all of them, you can check all of them, report all of them, but you have to ask because the program says we need the information.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I have a client, she's got a disability, she moves into this apartment complex. Well, they end up putting her on the 6th floor at the time the elevator was working. The elevator broke down and she had to walk up 6 flights of stairs every single day. She had a bad hip. They end up evicting her because she just stopped paying the rent. She was like, I'm not gonna pay her rent, and she's already had to have hip surgery, and they knew she was sick. I mean, is there anything that we can do as case managers to report this or?
In an ideal world, that client should have gone to a legal aid organization who then would have informed her about not paying rent until it was fixed. And when the landlord tried to evict her for not paying rent, there'd be backup to say, she's got the money once you make that repair.
And
if you could do that in certain states.
Right.
You can't do that in all states.
Right.
One more
Mhm.
question. HUD, when clients get approved from HUD, they're telling them that they can only rent a 1-bedroom apartment. But the problem is, when they go to try to find a 1-bedroom apartment, there's none available. I mean, you can very, very seldom find a 1-bedroom apartment.
So,
They will not let them lease a 2-bedroom.
so what we'll talk about tomorrow is occupancy standards and that rent standard. Because basically when push comes to shove, it doesn't matter necessarily the size, it's the maximum rent. Right.
It just still has to be under the.
Is this HOPWA TVRA?
Yeah,
or a different program?
Ours is on the.
Okay.
It's other HOPWA.
But so even if a program says they have to do that and there's a medical reason for a larger, they would have to go through that process for a reasonable accommodation. Right? Because at that moment they'd say you can only move into a 1-bedroom, and they'd say, I have a live-in aid. A live-in aid needs their own sleeping space. They're not a family member. They can't say absolutely not. They're violating the ADA then.
But if they can't find a one-bedroom, and that's the issue,
Yeah.
we're running out of it.
Right, so-
And then, but then the 2 bedrooms, of course, are more, but sometimes we can find them where they are under the standard rent. And that, then we are allowed to, but it's very few that we have that are under that. So it's
Just wait till we talk about rent standards tomorrow. It'll be a whole new world. Get ready. There's a million ways to work around this, at least for HOPWA, right? I can't speak to every
When
program.
you say HUD, do you mean house insurance vouchers?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah. We know it's more than that. That's just one.
They're all HUD.
Yeah, they're all HUD. We're talking about when they get their voucher.
Yeah.
That's what.
So to make sure you're not violating these, to make sure you're offering assistance and providing assistance to anyone, regardless of who they are, we're going to tie back in affirmative outreach. So when we talk about this now, we're really going to say who's the least likely to apply for assistance, right? Because that's who you're really going to be targeting when you come up with affirmative outreach policy. Because if everyone who comes to your agency looks alike, sounds alike from the same places, chances are you're not going to need to worry about outreaching that population. Somehow they know. So a HOPWA program must consider the demographic characteristics of the community and of the target population. Examples of persons who might find it more difficult to apply include, but are not limited to, so some ways to do affirmative outreach, people with limited English proficiency. Right, so in some of your communities, if you have populations or pockets of people whose primary language is not English, your program as part of any affirmative outreach policy should ensure that there are written materials available in alternative languages and interpreters are available. Those are all HOPWA eligible costs. Right, so if you need to translate forms, you can charge that to that activity. If you need an interpreter, you can charge that to that activity. So if someone wants to enroll in case management, HOPWA funded case management, and you need to translate some of your case management forms and get an interpreter for case management, charge that to support services. So making sure your affirmative outreach could include people with specific disabilities. So people with disabilities such as a brain injury, right? Making sure that if you know that there's a group out there that would need it, right? How do you outreach and target that population? And then particularly, how do you design your program to make sure that you're meeting regulatory requirements, but they can still comprehend some of this complex or written information that they need to understand. And what's key now, particularly as HUD programs, but even HOPWA, is looking at equity as a whole, but making sure you're doing an affirmative outreach to people of different colors and nationalities, right? So if a community is largely Caucasian, people of color will be less likely to apply. Chances are your program is not marketing itself to the correct places. So it's figuring out, how do you target that, right? So how do you go out and market yourself to nonprofits and organizations that those populations do go to, right? Or publications that those persons read or follow online, right? Because then that's ultimately what ties together your whole affirmative outreach policy. These are the populations that particularly since you all have your surveillance data, right? What are the people we know that have HIV who aren't coming through our HOPWA doors? How do we try to market those people to at least make them aware of our services? Because by even doing that, even if you don't necessarily have the money to help them right away, they're going to come in, you could offer referrals for other things, and that's going to start to build that sense of who really needs your assistance. Program should consider whether it's reaching the entire entitlement area with information about the availability of assistance. So this talks about making sure you have a written strategy, the actual policy to outreach these. So here's one thing that we've seen people do to sort of operate some of the ideas is you've created marketing materials under Resource ID, you've translated them to different languages under Resource ID, and now you're going to mail them to different community groups that serve those populations and charge that to Resource ID. But what you want to do is making sure whether it's at your level or at the grantee level, you have documentation, not just of your policy, but what you actually did. Right? Because it's possible you won't get anyone that will call, right? Because maybe they actually don't know of anyone who's HOPWA eligible. So it's doing your due diligence to say, we've tried and here's how we tried. So to try to achieve all of these goals of non-discrimination and equity, so just sort of programmatically at your level, review your program policies, procedures, applications, and forms to make sure they're as equitable as possible. So make sure that you're reviewing your questions to make sure questions are inclusive and aren't excluding persons, right? Especially from protected classes. I was going to say maybe it's not surprising, but maybe you guys are, right? That you know of organizations that will still ask questions about what's your gender, male or female? Neither. Nope, male or female. If it's not eligibility requirement, why do you care, right? Include other ones. Why does it, right? Ultimately, why does it matter? And that builds that relationship up. We talked about translating all of the forms, particularly to those that are needed in your area, because always be reasonable, right? You could spend a lot of money translating all of your forms into 186 languages, right? But if there's only English and Spanish really in your area, that's probably all you really need. So review your process for collecting information, particularly for your intakes and applications. So provide multiple ways and methods for persons to apply for assistance. There is no requirement that intakes be done face-to-face. Right, so particularly in rural areas, maybe you do want to go face-to-face, right? But also that doesn't mean they need to meet in the office. Maybe you're meeting in a community setting, right? Somewhere public. I said maybe it's doing a remote intake or application. So none of that is a HOPWA requirement to say you have to come to the office, you have to be here, right? Doesn't exist. Be flexible in how you collect information and only require the required information. right? So if the client says, I don't want to answer the question about race and ethnicity, put a line through it and move on, right? It's not one of those 2 bullet points, so why have the fight? But if they do say, I don't want to talk about my HIV status or just provide documentation, say, okay, we're going to have to stop for a second. This one's key. I can't let you skip that. Provide interpreters. This is where I'd also note what's important for us here, and it was important in Maine, is the likelihood of getting an in-person interpreter is slim to none, particularly for some languages, or even some of our clients would refuse in-person interpreters because if it was a really niche language, they were afraid that they would know that person, right? So they'd say, absolutely not, I do not want it. So we would use phone interpretation because there would be some random Joe Schmo somewhere in the world who's picking up a phone, right? So also just think through that, right? Because we have seen programs that say, nope, we use the local university, we require the local university. Well, how do you know that they're not going to know that person and you inadvertently disclose someone's status? So make sure your policies and procedures are inclusive and not weeding out any individual for any reason, but particularly those from protected classes. Create an affirmative outreach policy. And the key to all of this, right? Because we can all be great and think we know about what we know, always involve persons with lived expertise. So that's the way that we always say involve persons with HIV who are using your services in every step of this. They are an expert in what it means to have HIV and receive HOPWA. So the number of programs that do not listen to their clients and say that person's just full of it, right? So clients should be involved in reviewing forms, right? In reviewing questions, in reviewing policies and procedures. They know what it's like. So a lot of agencies will listen to client feedback when it's about others. You're right, that agency's trash. I can't believe they didn't call you back. But they'll say, but my own case manager didn't call back. And say, oh, well, they're just busy. I get it. Right? So involve persons in all of this, because this is really key now as HUD programs, including HOPWA, look at equity. Right? Because unless you're in their shoes and walking through that and getting the assistance, there's no way to actually be equitable unless they are involved in as many decisions and processes as possible. So don't be afraid of involving these persons. Once again, then, to tie back into resource ID, now you could potentially have money to have focus groups to sit down and say, like, we're going to talk about our intake or application. If you want to come and talk about it, come on in, and you have a place to charge that time. The last but not least, this idea of being low barrier, because if you really want to meet these and you really want to serve clients, you want to be as low barrier as possible. So for the 56th time today, screen in, not out for assistance, right? The goal is always, how do I get this person enrolled in HOPWA? If you're coming at it through that lens, it's a lot easier than what are the 26 things that you can't say, I'm going to weed you out. So always try to include them in. Eliminate any unnecessary eligibility criteria. I don't know if you guys have any. If you do, chat with Henry about, now that you've heard it 18 times, there's no reason to have this. Offer flexible intake application times and methods, right? So there's no reason it has to be face-to-face. If you can offer any flexibility in the times that you do it, right? So if there is flexibility in schedules, usually like an ASO or a nonprofit, you have pretty standard hours, right? Like a 9 to 5 or 8 to 4. But that also means you're excluding persons who probably work the same hours. So if there is a way to have a few staff to have a flexible schedule, because maybe someone needs to come in at 7 to do an intake, maybe they need to come in at 6, right? So thinking through that to make sure if one of the populations in your area is working people and that's a barrier to coming in, finding a way to offer alternative days, times, and methods. Whenever possible, not only does it save your own sanity, but it makes it low barrier, institute remote appointments.
See, I thought when they did away with the waivers, the remote appointments and all that went away too. Again, I started during COVID, so I didn't know that thing worked. So I thought that went away when the waivers were.
If you were to read through HOPWA regulations, it says nothing about intakes, including how to do them. So there is no federal requirement.
What about like our release of information? If they do that over the phone and I sign it and say over the phone, that's fine. Because they did
Get a
that.
witness speech to do that.
Yeah, at our agency, when we did
Because
it.
I'm in the same boat y'all were in. I have a lot
Yeah.
of area to cover, so.
So yeah, in our agency, if we were to do a phone release versus an in-person, we'd have a second person serve witness. So I would be talking to a client.
HOPWA staff person.
Right.
Witnesses, it wasn't just me and the.
Okay,
So,
so
yeah.
if I write it in my case notes, I can have Ms. K witness it on the ROI.
Yeah, just fill out the release like you would, just say verbal release obtained over the phone, sign date, witness, sign your name, who the verbal release is for, Steve Ellis, witness, date. Then you could follow up by mail,
And then have.
Yeah.
Okay.
if your organization will allow you to do that.
Well, they would, but I wouldn't really have to have. it.
Yeah.
Because also having that witness also covers your own butt. So you didn't ask the client, and they said it was okay. Then they got mad that you actually called that person and says, I never gave you that permission. So having that second person that gets on the phone and says, hey, Heather, just confirming you gave Steve permission to talk to your landlord about this. Yes, I did.
And it was the exception. It wasn't the rule.
Yeah.
It was something that we really needed to do and get done.
Just to get.
Yeah.
The case
Something
load
done.
done.
Yep.
But even in that, we see programs that to this day require case managers to meet in person with clients every 3 months. If the client's not there, they'll start termination. And so we'll say, but why, right? Like if it's not needed, even being in person. So in some places, they'll force case managers to drive an hour and if the client's not there. And most of the time, it's for a perfectly legitimate reason they're not there. Their kid got sick at school, they had to go pick them up, they just crossed paths. Right, so really think through even how you carry out your work, because not only does it mean you're low barrier, but you're probably saving yourself most of your time, not pulling your hair out, thinking I have to do this because it's not required. Reduce unnecessary documentation requirements, such as it is not a HOPWA requirement that you get third-party written verification. Right, so like the actual source documentation. It's best practice to start there. Right, but we talked about earlier about clients self-attesting some things. You start with the best and work your way down. So if a client says, I cannot get something in writing from my mom saying that she gives me $500 a month, right? That doesn't mean you have to say absolutely not until I get that letter from your mom, we can't move forward, right? So some programs think you have to have that source documentation and you don't.
We just have to document that we asked for it.
That due diligence, correct.
This is getting easier and easier.
There's no requirement for hard signatures. So we talked about that with the releases, but in anything, the number of people during COVID that said, how do I get my client to sign this application? It's a requirement. We say, where? Where is that a requirement? Show me the regs, right? I'm a regs nerd. I've read through most of these programs. It is not there, right? So you want an acknowledgement, but they don't need to sign, right? So that also saves you that hassle of now I'm going to drive 45 minutes and hope that so-and-so's home and they're not home and now I still can't process their STRMU application. And then finally, only terminate assistance as a last resort, right? Because if you're going to terminate someone, you're sort of throwing their life upside down, right? So they're really, if you were to look in HOPWA regs and some of the guidance out there, you're really only terminating in pretty limited instances and circumstances. What programs think they need to terminate people for aren't real, right? So you do need to terminate if someone is violating regulatory requirements or you can't prove regulatory requirements. If people are being very unsafe, right, towards staff, or if someone's coming in threatening to kill staff, you don't have to say like, well, it's okay. But even in some of these situations, it doesn't mean you still terminate assistance, right? Because maybe you just change how that client can interact. So if a client comes into your agency is always difficult, but when someone goes to visit at home, they're not difficult, don't make them come in, right? So you don't terminate because they come in and start screaming. You just say, you just can't come to the office anymore. It's now our office rule, you can't be here. We don't jeopardize their housing just because they came in screaming. Right, so there are really only a few reasons you should go through the process of terminating someone, because that's really the low barrier.
We'll talk about that tomorrow.
Right. And so we'll talk about too this idea of making sure you go through that process and offer due process and appeals if you are going to propose to terminate. Right, because termination isn't like a single moment in time and it's over. Right, if you're going to propose to terminate, then you have to go through a process, and the client has to have an opportunity to fix it. Because what we also want to do to low barrier is to understand clients make mistakes, and regardless of the reason of that mistake, we're going to give them the grace to fix it. So they did lie to you about their income. but they're going to provide the income so you can fix it, that's good. We're not going to terminate you. Hopefully you've learned your lesson. You won't do it again. You've kept your housing. There's a few hoops we're going to have to jump through, but just because they messed up doesn't mean they're terrible people and shouldn't have stable housing. So that's also then how you avoid these issues of making sure that it doesn't look like you're only terminating people who are from a certain country, who speak a certain way, who think a certain way, right? Because part of all of this isn't just an actual discrimination. Sometimes it's the perception of, right? So if you really are low barrier, you never have to worry. A client saying, you are only proposing to terminate me because of my skin color. You could say, nope, it's because you refuse to provide income documentation. That's it, right? If they get an attorney, you could say, absolutely, right? Here's our process. So make sure that you are offering your programs equitably, especially for protected groups or classes. This includes perceived or actual gender identity. And I'll stress this particularly for non-HOPWA programs, because I know there are emergency shelters out there that still don't get this idea. And so you can always push back and say, I don't think you can do that. Make sure you embed equity throughout your program, especially the affirmative outreach. And once again, always try to involve persons with lived expertise in all that you do. That way you know you're getting an equitable program design, because people who actually have skin in the game help create the program. Any questions?
Million, but we'll make it.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Day one is complete. Pick up tomorrow morning at 8:30 in the morning. Yes. And thank you guys online. We'll pick up again tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning. And hopefully if there's any other issues technology-wise, we'll have them worked out. We have shoddy internet here at the Capitol, surprisingly. But thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
And there's swimming. Stop here, or we can take it.